Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 8, Emotion and Motivation, Part 6, Stress. So, how and why do we experience stress? Well, stress is a physical and mental response to a challenging or threatening situation. And stressors are any kind of stressful stimuli, a condition demanding our adaptation. And like emotion, stress has four components, and that would include the physiological response, such as a knot in the stomach, a behavioral response like aggression, subjective feelings such as fear, and finally a cognitive response as far as thinking about what is the appropriate way to respond. So our stress response reflects our body's millennial old ability to become quickly aroused to meet some type of emergency. And humans who have responded quickly and effectively to danger have survived and passed those responsive genes on to their ancestors. We are descendants of the ancestors who were best suited to the fight or flight response, which is likely an innate response programmed into our brains. Traumatic stress. Okay, a catastrophe is like a really devastating event, and one's response to a catastrophe can have a devastating effect on our physical and mental health. You could have an individual who might have reoccurring nightmares or prolonged issues with heart disease, or perhaps maybe high blood pressure as a result of some of these stressors. So there are 5 responses to extreme natural and human-caused disasters, and this was compiled by Conan and Aaron back in 1980. And it basically is like this. There's a psychic numbness. This is the shock and confusion that literally happens right after a catastrophe, followed by an automatic action. And sometimes we have little awareness of our own experience, meaning if I suffered a devastating event, as far as the initial feelings that I had, sometimes we just forget and we kind of go into automatic pilot, and hence we have a poor recall of what actually occurred. The third is a communal effect where people pull together resources and collaborate. A lot of times you see this when we've had devastating natural disasters that have impacted communities. After that has all passed, then we have a letdown. This is the depleted energy. Sometimes they comprehend and feel the tragedy's impact. And finally, there is the recovery. This is when our survivors adapt to the changes created by the disasters. This is how we move on and we start getting our lives back together. PTSD, this is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is actually something that is more of a recent terminology when we talk about the field of psychology, even though PTSD has been around for ages, but it is the delayed stress reaction in which an individual involuntarily re-experiences some kind of traumatic event. PITS, this is perpetuation induced traumatic stress. This is when our participation-induced traumatic stress occurs commonly in soldiers who have killed someone in combat. It is a symptom of PTSD, but years ago, some of these items might have been labeled as shell shock. But it's this idea that sometimes people will freeze up, they will have reoccurring nightmares, they will become very short-tempered, and a lot of it is because of some of the events that they have experienced. And it's not indicative to just soldiers, but people who have experienced, accidents or great trauma in their life can suffer from PTSD. So PTSD, men versus women. Men cite experiences with physical attacks, such as military combat, threats with a weapon, or being held captive or hostage. Where women, they cite more experiences of such as rape or sexual molestation, physical abuse, neglect during childhood. Both will suffer numbness to everyday events, alienation from other people, problems with sleeping, guilt about surviving, difficulty concentrating, and exaggerated startled response. The brain may also undergo physical changes to the hormone regulating system to develop kind of what we call a hair trigger response. In other words, we are maybe overreacting to minor incidences with things like aggression, making the victim of PTSD overreact to minor stressors. The physical stress response. Uh, there is an initial arousal, also a protective behavior, that's your fight or flight response. There is an internal response of the autonomic nervous system as well as the endocrine system, and a decreased effectiveness in the immune system, meaning your person is more vulnerable to diseases and such. Arousal. The symptoms of that's an abrupt and intense physiological arousal, such as an accelerated heartbeat, quickened breathing, increased blood pressure, profuse perspiration. Acute stress is the temporary pattern of stressors, activated arousal with distinct onsets, but limited in duration. The fight or flight response. This is a sequence of internal processes preparing an organism for struggle or escape, occurs when a situation is interpreted as being threatening. And Walter Cannon, who, if you remember back to the Cannon-Bard study, he first recognized the fight or flight response. He revealed that a threat stimulated a sequence of activities in our nerves and glands. The impact of chronic and long-term stressors, the internal stress response can become prolonged, producing physical weakness, illness, and even death. General adaptation syndrome, or AKA GAS. Uh, this was developed by a man named Hans Sale, and he was Canadian. He discovered that different stressors trigger essentially the systematic reaction or the general physical response, or AKA GAS, the general adaptation syndrome. And so here are the stages. You have the alarm reaction. This is when the body mobilizes its resources to cope with the stressor. The hypothalamus sets off an emergency response in the hormonal system, such as your adrenal glands. And this might result in high blood pressure, blocked vessels, bleeding ulcers. Then there is the stage of resistance. The body adapts to and uses resources to cope with the stressor, such as resisting the stressor. If an additional stressor is introduced, one may not be able to resist it. And hence, that leads us to the final stage, the stage of exhaustion. This is when the body is depleted of its resources in responding to the ongoing stressor, running on empty, the physiological exhaustion. Perhaps even in extreme cases, wearing a person down that they're vulnerable to death. So when we take a look at this, you can look at the bottom with the little graph here. Your alarm stressor, the body kind of builds itself up to resist it. If more stress is or kind of added to it, we could, get depleted probably much faster. But typically, if we have successful resistance, that resistance peaks and eventually drops, and eventually we can relax after that period of time. So withdrawal, an individual can become entrapped when efforts to fight or run away are blocked at every turn, such they freeze in the face of danger, they become emotionally withdrawn or disengaged. Sometimes you will see this with elderly when they feel like they don't have a lot of say in how they're being cared for, and hence they may withdraw and eventually find themselves in a position where their health is very vulnerable. Finally, the tend and befriend model. This is a stress response model proposing that females are biologically predisposed to respond to threats by nurturing and protecting offspring and seeking social support when there is some kind of stress in their lives. Probably seen more in women than in men. And part of that is the belief that women, because they are mothers, that motherly instinct is to tend and befriend others to survive. Stress in the immune system. We can talk about psychoneuroimmunology. This is a multidisciplinary field that studies the influence of mental state on the immune system. An example would be the caretaker with Alzheimer's disease, immunosuppression. A lot of times we find that individuals who are caring for a loved one who has Alzheimer's are more vulnerable to getting sick themselves. Cytokines, this would be the hormone, like chemicals facilitating communication between the brain and the immune system. They alert the brain to distress in the body, and the brain releases its own cytokine to reduce the energy output, causing fevers and blissfulness. Type A personalities, this is a behavior pattern characterized by intense anger and competitiveness and perfectionism. And then you have the more relaxed type B personality characterized by relaxed, unstressful approaches to life. Finally, learned hopelessness or helplessness. This is kind of along the line of talking about the elderly. This is a passive resignation following a reoccurring failure or punishment. You may see this in school and nursing homes and hospitals. Patients are not encouraged to make their own decisions and take control of their life, and hence they allow other people to just kind of make decisions for them and become very passive as a result of that. Developing our own resilience, the resilient mindset. This is Brooks and Goldstein theory. This is a feeling of certain control in your life, communicating and interacting effectively with others, establishing realistic goals and expectations, learning from both successes and failures, feeling empathy and compassion for others, and feeling special. Not necessarily self-centered, but that something is unique about you, that you're contributing in some way. Thank you very much.